Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and welcome to this flipped professional development seminar. And the topic of this seminar is really important: the selection of examiners. Research higher degrees activate an array of policies and procedures, and there are reasons for that. Regulation matters, governance matters, and indeed quality assurance matters. But really the art and the craft of doctoral candidatures emerge at one point, and that is through the examination. Examinations are the moment for a PhD. They're the moment of quality assurance for our PhD students, but they also confirm and conform to the reputation of our institutions. So as you can pick up, the PhD examination matters a lot. But I wanted to include Professor Steve Redhead in this conversation for many reasons, but one actually was a comment he made to our new PhD student Vicky last week. Vicky had her first meeting, with us last week, and in the first 5 minutes of this first meeting, Steve said to Vicky, we need to be considering right at the start who we believe the examiners will be for this PhD. I want us to start to think about 4 or 5 names. I want you to write them on a piece of paper, and when you're working on your project for the next few years, I want you to look at those names and think about your audience. Now, I thought that was brilliant. There's something powerful about beginning a PhD with the end in mind. And Steve does matter to this conversation. He's worked in 7 universities in 3 countries. He's published 16 books, soon to be 17 books, hundreds of refereed articles and book chapters. He's a well-known journalist and commentator about education, both online and offline. His best-known books include Rave Off, End of the Century Party, Repetitive Beat Generation, and also some profound scholarship on Paul Virilio and Jean Baudrillard. But most importantly, I think, for this conversation, he is a very experienced supervisor and a really internationally unusual in terms of how experienced he is as an examiner. He's been a head of school, he's been an associate dean for research, he's been a sub-dean of graduate studies and the head of major research centres. Steve is currently the Professor of Cultural Studies at Flinders. So, hi Steve.
Hi.
Let's have this powerful conversation, an important conversation for our colleagues at Flinders about examinations. Now, let's start with the specificity, if you will, of the Australian experience of the PhD examination. So, Steve, how should our colleagues, how should supervisors contact international examiners about Australian PhDs in a way that they are aware they're only examining the script and there's no oral examination?
Yeah, I think it is a very important question how you do this. And I think we have to remember what globalisation actually means, Australia's position within the globe. I mean, we're sitting in our home in Adelaide at the moment, looking across the ocean to Antarctica. That's
so
one
posh.
aspect of globalisation.
So posh.
But also, I've just been watching the opening ceremony for the Olympics in the Maracanã Stadium in Brazil, and it made me think how little I actually understand globalisation. I forget how many countries, for example, there are in the globe. Yeah. And I think one of the things that we have to remember about Australian higher education not having the oral exam, or in most cases not having the oral exam, although starting to think about it, is that gives an opportunity to be really global, to actually think of examiners all around the globe, or potential examiners all around the globe. So I think there's a real potential in that. In oral exams, in the oral exam system generally, although the possibility is there for international examiners, most of the time that doesn't happen. The examiners who come along to the oral exam don't actually sign in on Skype. They're there because they've travelled, in the UK case, from London to Manchester or something. So that opportunity to be really global is missed. And I think Australia actually has, by not having an oral exam, has actually already been quite international in that. And there are all sorts of really good reasons for that. And, good luck for that, even to exist in the future for a bit longer. But I think the choice of the examiner, what I'm really saying is the choice of examiner across the globe is really important. And I think, it's what I did say to Vicky, our new student, you've got to start thinking that your audience is not your supervisor.
There it is.
It's the examiner. And the examiner in the Australian system is going to examine the project, not you as a student, because you never get a chance, apart from the text, to talk to that examiner.
Yeah.
So it's a very important choice. So my answer, I suppose, to your question is that you should be very careful and take opportunity, certainly in the Australian case, to take opportunity to be international, genuinely international and global.
And be upfront. I tend to, and you as well, when we're approaching examiners for Australian doctorates, and it's different from how you would approach them in the UK or in North America, I actually add a couple more sentences about the nature of the Australian examination process.
Yes.
So right at the start, they've got a sense, this is what it looks like, so it's not a surprise. Yes. And ironically, we probably should tell the story. When I first met Steve, obviously we were not together, we weren't remotely together. I approached him, having never met him, as a PhD examiner for one of my first PhD students, who was looking at electronic dance culture, and obviously Professor Rave himself was the #1 draft pick for an examination. So I'd never met him before, but I approached Steve and asked if he would examine. I didn't provide that detail, Steve, so would you like to convey to our viewers what actually happened?
Yes, this was the time when I was working in Manchester, and living in Manchester, and through the Manchester Institute of Popular Culture work that we'd done, I did have, a certain expertise, but also a certain reputation in that area of work. So I did get approached by people from time to time globally to be examiner. And when Tara contacted me, and we didn't know each other, this was well before we actually met, I thought I would be able to go to Australia for the first time. I hadn't been to Australia. I thought, this is going to be great. Get out of Manchester for a while, be an examiner in a lovely new country. And of course, I suddenly realised, to my horror, that I wasn't going to be there, and I was simply being sent the text, which was very good, but I was disappointed.
He was just, but again, ever since that existential moment, I've been very, very careful and cautious to make sure full transparency is in place, and they're very much aware of what is going on in terms of processes and procedures. So it's funny, but it was also a very early warning, and that I think was my 3rd or 4th PhD completion. So you live long enough, you learn. Steve, we therefore want to talk about, and that's a pretty good transition in terms of my era early on when I was approaching examiners, we need to talk about early career researchers and inexperienced examiners. And all the studies around the world, quant and qual, show that early career researchers, the less experienced you are as an examiner, the harder you are as an examiner. So men and women who have just completed their PhD, they are the most difficult, complex examiners. They find the most errors, they are the most nasty in some ways in terms of their reports. So it's a very difficult and sad area. So how should we as supervisors handle those problems? In some Australian universities there are 3 examiners, and often when I've had systems with 3 examiners, I've taken a risk every time and added 1 early career researcher so that they learn as an examiner and it won't destroy the student's life. The problem we have at Flinders is that we only have 2 external examiners, so I'm much more reticent with our students to take that risk. So how would you handle this very complicated and intricate situation?
Yes, I think it is difficult, and you are aware as an early examiner, which I was at one time, of both the burden and the sort of the duty of this position. I've done 90 now. I've just got one from the University of Sydney, which I've been sent, which is my 90th examination. But I started off really not knowing. I had to learn on the job, and I think that's what most people would say. I certainly never had any training, but I had been part of CNA, which was the regulatory body for what are now called post-1992 universities in the UK. That gave me a lot of understanding by being able to talk to people who were very experienced at that time. So I was mentored, I think, in a lot of ways. But the difficulty is to understand whether someone is going to be a hard examiner or a reasonable one or a less than reasonable one. And I think the difficulty is actually understanding the broad experience and inexperience of the examiners around the world, the people who are willing to do this. And as a supervisor, you've really got to be very careful. You've got to work with the student, I think, but you've got to do a lot of work in the nomination of the examiner. It means researching the background of people.
I call it digital stalking.
Yeah, digital stalking. I think that's what you have to do. At least now, in that globalised world of higher education, you can do that. At one time, you were relying very often on people you'd met at a conference, and you really didn't know that person. You hardly knew their work very often. So I think that question is a really difficult one. How do you do it? You certainly have to make sure that, as a supervisor, with the student, you research the background of potential people. I mean, sometimes it's obvious from the examination, from the text that you're examining, because the person is mentioned throughout.
That's right.
And that does happen. There's no question of that, and then they become the obvious person. But I think most of the time, you could be picking almost anybody.
Yeah, and that's very disturbing. And so, but the one advantage, can I say, of digitisation is that there's a lot more information available. So I do digitally stalk every possible examiner that I'm considering, you're considering, we're considering, and of course there's a lot of leakage about bad behaviour, particularly through blogs. So students let rip about what an examiner has done on a blog, and that's available for you to find. So perhaps that's one strategy for you to consider. So the next question, therefore, is the harder one, and we've already raised some of these problems. What are you looking for when you select an examiner? Are there requirements? What are you after, Steve?
Again, I think it's a really difficult question, and you can, but an important one, because the answer to it is certainly I suppose obviously you're looking for an expertise, particular expertise in the areas of work. But because so much of the work now is interdisciplinary, and PhDs, in order to break ground, to be original contributions to knowledge, you're having to go beyond disciplines in many ways. Yeah. My work in current book on Roman theoretical times is about what I call post-disciplinary times that we're in. So that, if that's right, then it is more difficult to pick up somebody's expertise, because you're wanting someone, if you like, in the hole between law and criminology, say, or philosophy and cultural studies, or whatever it is. Yeah. And the specific expertise you're looking for, may not actually be there, because it's developing work in a particular interdisciplinary, cutting-edge area. So I think the expertise is certainly what you're looking for. You're also looking for someone who will be involved and be prepared to be professionally and ethically involved. That's a lot more difficult these days. People are not necessarily seeing themselves as part of a professional group of people on a global scale. They're basically not as they used to be. People who felt that there was some sort of duty and obligation in this. So I think you do have to check people's background and perhaps what people have said about them and so on, ask colleagues about them. And I think you do have to check in advance what sort of professional person you're going to be nominating and working with, because very often you won't know this person. That's right.
And that's a good thing. Not knowing them actually is a good thing. That's ethical, because you're selecting them on the basis of their intellectual expertise, rather than having a drink with them at a conference.
Yes.
So I think that's a great thing.
I do too.
But also what I would suggest is be very conscious. I have certain deal breakers, and I know I'm very unpopular on this and you disagree with me on this, but if you have got a traditional doctorate in place, I am always very reticent to use colleagues that have had a PhD by prior publication. So if their experience, if their qualification is a PhD by prior publication or a PhD by publication, and they are assessing a traditional thesis, I'm much more reticent to select them. Now I know I'm incredibly unpopular for saying that, but I have been burnt far too many times to take that risk anymore. So one variable I do investigate is what type of doctorate they actually submitted themselves. It's experiential, but if they've got that experience and not much else in terms of experience of supervising and examining others, then that's all you've got. So that's one of my deal breakers. I know it's not the case for you.
But I do think if you're really taking advantage of globalisation,
Yeah.
which is how we started off this conversation, then you'll realise that you're not just talking about one or two people. People sort of start to think, well, there's only about 5 people in the world who can do this, but actually you're talking hundreds, if not thousands.
That's right.
Globalisation, if you really remember the Olympics example,
Yeah.
you're talking hundreds of countries, thousands of people actually in different disciplines, so and particularly interdisciplinary. So the choice is huge. It's just a matter of getting in touch with them.
And we should welcome that.
We should.
You and I always
Definitely.
laugh when we're wherever we are, whatever country we are, whatever university we are, when somebody says something random like, and even junior staff say this, and we sort of look at them like, really? They say stuff like, well, there's only 2 or 3 great experts in this field in the world, and I know all of them. And you're sort of going, wow, that's a bit of a bold and a beautiful moment, isn't it? That's fantastic. And of course, it's absolute nonsense. There are hundreds and thousands of journals out there with these emerging, fantastic scholars.
Yeah.
So, you and I know a lot of people, and every single day we meet new and fantastic people working in these fields. So, why shouldn't our students have those opportunities of being examined by these fantastic, emerging and exciting scholars?
Yes, and there is a breakdown of the elites there, a breakdown of people who would actually sort of reproduce their power. I think there's some really interesting things about globalisation and internationalisation here, and we should be able to take advantage of it.
Yeah, and also not just simply going, we'll do the posh conversation quickly here as well, the notion of going to the posh universities. Yes. As we know through the RAE and the RAF, because excellence was much more widely distributed than they expected, they had to invent phrases like pockets of excellence. So you might like to say, Steve, if you're working in ultra-realist criminology, you're working in some really edgy areas of criminology, who would you be going to?
Places like the Teesside Centre for Realist Criminology at the University of Teesside, which wouldn't be the most obvious place for anybody to go until you start to look at the work that is being produced there. And I think a lot of that, the breakdown of the elite, the breakdown of power brokers, if you like, in all sorts of disciplines, is the thing that's really happened over the last 20 or 30 years in global academia. We should take advantage of it.
So well said. And the next question, I'll just hammer this down, an issue you raised about a minute or so ago about interdisciplinary theses. Could I also do a big shout out to all our guys and gals working in groundwater, because they do fantastic work
Absolutely.
between environmental science and of course cultural geography.
Yep.
So that's a fascinating example of profound interdisciplinarity, wonderful group of colleagues there. So in an examination, how do you manage this interdisciplinarity, knowing that no single examiner, particularly if you've only got 2, can cover all of the terrain?
Yeah, I think particularly if you're really sticking to that idea of original contributions to knowledge, that seems to me in all sorts of disciplines and between disciplines is what is happening. And we use these terms interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity, post-disciplinarity quite glibly, but actually I do think we're in that era now. We're at the beginnings of that era where, if you like, one way of doing it is to take one person from one of the disciplines, if it is really interdisciplinary, one person from the other discipline, from another discipline,
yes.
and maybe one outside of that.
Yeah.
And obviously you're trying to get expertise in the particular field to some extent, but the fields are shifting. I think that's really the point. And actually trusting that someone has disciplinary expertise would be one way of doing it. Choosing somebody, as you say, in that particular area, life science, cultural geography, for example.
Yeah.
And then somebody outside of that if you've got 3 examiners. But actually, what you're really looking for is someone committed to that interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity and post-disciplinarity.
Yeah.
Again, those terms are used glibly, but actually, at the same time as these barriers are breaking down, what you've got is incredible conservatism in the disciplines. So you're going to someone who may well say, I don't want to, I will do this PhD, I will examine this PhD, but actually what you find out afterwards is that they're anti-interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
You don't know that until you talk to them.
That's
so
right.
I think that the issue is actually still the general one of doing the research on the background of the person.
Yeah. And going through the publications very, very carefully.
Very careful.
One of my big issues is I go through their entire CV. I read all the articles. So that's when you pick up that problem about if they're patrolling the barriers of biology or English or a particular mode of qual or quant methods.
Yeah.
If you can see them in these articles really patrolling it, you go, right, we'll stay away from that person. And you do pick that up in a careful reading of methods in particular. So I really would recommend that.
Again, it's about doing the digital research.
Yeah, it really is. And look, we're going to go somewhere. We always try in these sessions to go to the really tough questions and the tough areas, and we're going to do it today. You and I have seen some very, very serious situations internationally when supervisors bring in their mates for examination over and over again. They just keep bringing in their mates, and of course their mates then return the favour, so it becomes what I call an examination star chamber. People just endlessly, it's like a rebounding, and people endlessly use the same men and women over and over again, mostly men, can I say. So Steve, why is this a bad idea, not only for a university, but also for knowledge and perhaps also for our students?
I think in terms of the question of transparency and professionalism and integrity, which are the sort of issues that we should be looking for here, then those practices are against all of those basic values. And I know that people have justified those things in the past on the basis, as we said before, that there are only 1.5 people in the world who could do this, and I actually know the one. But I do think it's back to the question of how international, how global we want to be, and indeed how professional we want to be. We've got to move on in these systems, especially when they're basically not regulated. My argument about globalisation is also that what we've had is deregulation in higher education. At one time it was overly regulated, probably. People would say, we're very, very careful not to keep having this person who's examined 20 PhDs for us in the past.
Yeah.
There was regulation of that, less and less regulation actually now.
Yeah.
But we've got this internationalisation, globalisation to take account of. I think that the bad behaviour is you see it in systems where there are oral exams, you see it in systems where there aren't oral exams. You're really trusting the ethics and the professionalism of people, and they often squander that. I've seen it very, very often. The way to do it, certainly part of the way to do it is actually to re-regulate.
Yes.
And my argument is really still very strong about that. I believe in regulatory bodies, both nationally and internationally, but we haven't got those. So you're having to make sure that, we're back to the question of digital stalking, we're really having to find out the most we possibly can about the person who we're going to nominate for examination. And I do stress that this is very, very important, not just at the end of the thesis. It's actually part of training the student to write for an audience, because in the end, in the Australian case, where there are not oral exams, in Flinders' case, for example, where you've got two examiners that you're looking for, the real audience for the student's thesis is 2 people. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. And the students don't understand that. Obviously, they're writing for a global audience, or for somebody who might read their article when it's published out of the PhD, or their friends, or their supervisors. Actually, the audience is not any of those people. No. It's 2 examiners.
Yeah. The other point I would also make is what this type of practice does to particular sub-disciplines. And I will actually name one. I will call one out. And that is the sociology of sport, for example. That's a very narrow area where supposedly everybody knew everybody else.
At one time.
Because of that inwardness, I would argue the quality of the field went down quite quickly, and it was right for what has happened now, thank goodness, with physical cultural studies.
Yeah.
So it became a group of a few men who patrolled the limits of what was going on in that discipline, and I would argue hurt the discipline, hurt the students, hurt writing in that field, hurt everything. And so I'm really grateful now that we have this young, exciting, emerging area with a whole series of emerging scholars in physical cultural studies. And if we didn't, the sociology of sport would have continued to go down and down and down.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's happened in others.
Oh, it has.
Other examples. I mean, I've certainly experienced that, and it's a really good area as an example. And the really good areas, the example there is that post-disciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, which physical cultural studies as a label now really provides, that is global. You know, the point about that is that you are talking, say in physical cultural studies areas, we want examiners in those areas. You could go to Bath in the UK, you could go to Maryland in the USA,
Waikato.
you could go to Waikato in New Zealand, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
The point is you've already globalised it, and people are not in each other's pockets.
Yeah.
And I think that's, you know, you're back to really, as I say, people who to some extent have squandered the opportunity to be really international and global at a time when that's a real possibility, and have just done mateship, and I think we should avoid that.
Very well said. I didn't know that he'd go into globalisation like he has in this conversation, by the way, but I did want to talk about one or a couple actually of national examples of nations that are known to be hard examiners. So there's been a series of studies done, and the hardest examiners on the planet are New Zealand examiners, kia ora, and Australian examiners. They are the hardest PhD examiners on the planet. Now that you have that information, Steve,
I didn't know that.
How would that impact on the choices that you would make? And also, I wonder why that's happened.
Yes, I wonder why that's happened. I mean, Australia and New Zealand, prior to this point, were the places in the world where you didn't have an oral exam for PhD.
And perhaps were invisible in that people didn't think of using a Kiwi examiner.
Yes, and New Zealand now does have, all its universities have an oral exam, and Australia is starting to move into that era. It may be something to do with that the examination was simply of the test. So you never got to know the student at all, and you never got an opportunity to see whether they could orally defend what is, as I say in the PhD, an original contribution to knowledge, high-level qualification in whatever subject area you're talking about. And as globalisation pushed, you were talking about, you know, at one level, better and better PhDs, not just people that scrape through. These are world-class pieces of work. So I don't know whether it was that. It could be that. I mean, it seems odd to me that those are the countries, and those are the countries that seem to have been harder on examination. That's one explanation, but I think my lesson, I think, would be that you've got to take this internationalisation seriously and to try to be more inclusive.
Yes.
And, you know, Europe or North America should be actually taking Australia and New Zealand examiners. If they haven't in the past, they should be.
Yeah, and I do think that's the other reason that Australia and New Zealand is simply invisible on the planet. I do think that's the nature of our lives, and most Australian and New Zealand academics don't work internationally. You and I have, and I just think we are invisible. And of course, that's the gift that keeps on giving, because if you haven't examined international theses with great regularity, you don't actually know the standard. So, for example, I once had a fascinating conversation about a month ago with somebody who said, oh, look, you know, Australia doesn't need an oral exam. I've conducted an oral exam and we don't need it. And I said, did I hear correctly? You've conducted
oral exam.
And you've generalised about oral examinations on the basis of doing one. And she went, yes. And we're sort of going, right, well, therein lies the problem, ladies and gentlemen. So that's the challenge. I use Kiwi examiners, probably 1 in every 10 examiners I would pick. I had to organise 4 last week. One was a fantastic New Zealand woman that I selected because she was absolutely on the money for the topic. The candidate had mentioned her all the way through. And again, I've read every publication she's ever written. Great, appears intellectually generous, colleague who's also written with her PhD students, so therefore would understand levels a bit more.
But I mean, technologically, you know, what Paul Virilio called city of the instant or futurism of the moment is here. You know, we have the technology to have changed all of this, basically. You know, we're almost starting again. And there is no reason at all why we can't actually bring together people from all over the world for an oral exam. And with a little bit of digital delay, basically, you know, Bob's your uncle. So I think we have to remember that. As I say, I think we're in a new era, and we can almost wipe away past practices.
Yeah, and to be frank with you, I'll say Skype, one of the ways I believe we will in future regulate and ensure the properly international standards of doctoral education, which is my life work really, is through the examination moment. So when we've got 2 or 3 international examiners meeting in Skype, having that meeting, that half an hour meeting before, running the examination, having the meeting afterward, that conversation is how we build that internationalisation of standards, I believe.
I agree too.
Powerful. Now, Steve, last couple of questions, and thank you so much for this. I didn't know it would be as stroppy as this, so thank you, darling one. People often complain about how difficult it is to get examiners or attract examiners. I've never found that as a problem ever, but why do you think it is a problem?
Oh, I have found it as a problem. I think more and more people in universities are commodified, and they see themselves as commodified. So that in the past there was a kind of duty and obligation. The university is a medieval institution, and you know, people got. It was a long time before they forgot obligations and duty. And I think some of those practices in the past were very good, because I think I certainly grew up as an academic feeling part of a community where I felt I was giving something back. You know, I felt pleased to be an academic and a global academic as my expertise grew. But I think now a lot of university academics, basically all they're considering is their workload, and they are trying to restrict that as much as possible. And being a PhD examiner is actually outside their workload, and they're not paid very much for it anyway, if they're paid at all. And basically they don't want to do it. And very often you do get people saying, no, I don't want to do it. For whatever reason, but actually I think what I've just said is the explanation, and I think that's becoming increasingly common, and therefore at one level the pool of examiners is shrinking.
Wow. So therefore let me ask the final question. This is a personal one, but it's also a professional one. I remember you said to me very early in our marriage, when you were already obviously a very senior professor for many years, but I was a humble senior lecturer. And you said to me, Tara, we must always say yes when we are asked to be a PhD examiner, because we are ethical, we are professional, and we read a great deal. We are up to date in the field. We have a responsibility to say yes. Now, why did you say that to me? And do you still agree with your younger self?
Yeah, I do. Because I think this is about 15 years ago, and I think we were on the cusp of that change from, if you like, the medieval university to the neoliberal university, actually. And I think that is what the process has been about. And at one time, people in universities did do work outside of their workload on a regular basis, whether that was for extra tuition or mentoring, or going to classes on a Saturday, or working till 9 o'clock at night, or whatever.
National quality assurance.
Exactly. I did that. I was on paid by CNA for 10 years.
External examination.
And that's absolutely right. So I grew up as an academic with those practices in mind. I was pleased to be part of that system, even though it was volunteering, really. Yeah. And I think the time that we had that discussion, which was probably about 13, 14, 15 years ago, actually that was on the cusp of the move. And now regularly people are not prepared to do those volunteering things. I'm not saying that they're wrong to do that. I'm simply observing that is happening on a massive scale now, withdrawal of labour power, actually. And therefore the people who are still involved in it, and I'm pleased to still be involved in it, should put themselves forward. They should, in fact, be really very professional, very ethical about it if they're going to do it, but they should do it.
Yeah. Steve, thank you so much for this conversation. It has been robust, as probably viewers and listeners can hear from this. We really care about this, but we also argue that universities should really care about this. As I've so often said, once we start to dumb down the PhD, we might as well close down our universities. This is the last stand for us. This is where we stand for quality and excellence and intellectual generosity. And if we let this stuff go, when we let these PhD examinations go, then my goodness me, we have to really question the point of our universities. So Steve, thank you so much for going there with me, and I hope it's been useful and provocative. Please feel free to disagree with us. We'll see you at the Lunchtime seminar, and please talk with us about this, because let's be honest, this is where we really need to have these conversations. Thank you for your time.